Hey everyone, my name is Wedge, and it's time once again for the tournament review. This week we're taking a look at the standard decks from the Star City Games Invitational. This season's Invitational was held in Seattle, Washington, and it brought us a top 8 with a pretty cool mix of decks. Sure, the specter of Obzan mid-range looms as always, but it only claims one spot this time. Overall, we have some chances this week to highlight decks that get a little less attention. Let's get started. The Invitational winner was Dylan Donegan, and he won it with Jessup tokens. Now this is one we've seen before, but it's still a bit unorthodox compared to the kind of decks we usually see in Standard. This is a deck that goes all in on Jessup Ascendancy, and definitely uses every part of the trigger. However, the real all-star is the word Untap. Casting a non-creature spell with a Jessup Ascendancy out lets you untap all your creatures and gives them +1/+1 to boot. What this means is that it's never safe to attack into a board of tokens, no matter how tapped they look. As long as there are a couple lands or a few tokens open, there could be a Lightning Strike or Stoke the Flames waiting for you, which untaps all the tokens and generally makes your life miserable. Speaking of which, we've mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. Jessup Ascendancy plus Stoke the Flames is a filthy synergy. Tap your tokens to cast the spell, then the Ascendancy triggers and untaps them again. Congratulations! You just dealt 4 damage and pumped your whole board for 0 mana. And it may not seem like much, but getting to loot whenever you cast a spell also really adds up. Not only do you get to sculpt the perfect hand, but you also fill your graveyard, which is perfect for powering your 4 treasure cruises. Next up is Dan Jessup taking the runner-up spot with Obzan midrange. And really there isn't a whole lot to say about this deck that hasn't been said already. We did see some interesting main deck decisions here. Nissa Worldwaker takes over for Ajani Mentor of Heroes in the one of Planeswalker slot. She proved effective at applying continuous pressure against control decks, and for that reason there was also a second copy on sideboard. There's also one of Dune Blast, which is always fun, especially when the creature you choose is Siege Rhino. But yeah, there's not much insight we can offer here that isn't already pretty well known. Third place went to Jim Davis playing Blue-White Control. Most control decks in recent big events have been blue-black, so it's cool to see the blue-white variation come back after a bit of a vacation. The blue half is pretty similar to the blue-black deck. Dissolve, Disdainful Stroke, Dig Through Time, Jace's Ingenuity, no real surprises here. There's only one Pearl Lake Ancient, because running white grants access to Elspeth Sun's Champion. Elspeth takes the other 3 win condition slots because, let's face it, she's really hard to deal with. Making her own blockers every turn helps with that. After Siege Rhino, not a whole lot has trampled in Standard. White also gives you access to End Hostilities, which is definitely a preferable sweeper to Perilous Vault, mainly because it cooperates with not only Elspeth, but also Banishing Light. Beyond that, running white also gives you some other strong removal. We've already mentioned Banishing Light. Devouring Light and Last Breath also appear. You'd be surprised when you think about it at just how many targets Last Breath has. It can take anything in Heroic and nip it in the bud. Chorus, Rabblemaster, and Seeker of the Way all have 2 power as well. The deck also uses Nullify, which is an interesting choice, but it makes a lot of sense. Most of the non-creature spells in Standard are creature removal, and this deck runs almost no creatures, so creatures are going to be most of what you want to counter. Caleb Scher took 4th place with Blue-White Heroic. Now the deck has been around for a few weeks, and we're starting to see it evolve. This build has abandoned Singing Bellstrike as removal, instead doubling down on Stratus Walk. Ajani's Presence joins the creature protection package, explicitly giving a creature indestructible in response to a hero's downfall or a sweeper, or whatever else would try to kill your guy. There's also a Stubborn Denial in the main deck this time around, which makes sense. Your biggest threats are non-creature spells, and when you're afraid of them, it's probably because you have one creature that's really big, which enables the Ferocious Claws. In 5th place, we had Sam Black with red-white tokens. As you might have guessed, it's red and it's white, and it uses a few cards that make tokens. As such, it also has some cards that take advantage of having large armies of tiny creatures. Stoke the Flames is a must-have in this kind of deck. Eidolon of Countless Battles lets you take advantage of having a ton of creatures, even if you don't attack with them. And Wingmate Rock falls into both categories. As long as you can spare 1 token to attack with, you can enable its raid trigger, and that trigger makes a token of its own. You can gain a lot of life from its attack trigger by swinging in with a ton of tokens. You can also suit it up with an Eidolon to get a huge flying attacker. Heliod's Pilgrim is there to search out a Chain to the Rocks, which takes care of big threats. There's also a Dragon Mantle that the Pilgrim can grab to let you pump your attackers or just to trigger prowess. that mainly helps your Force Seeker of the Wave, but there's also one Monastery Swift Spear. Overall, the deck gets to combine creatures, tokens, and other spells in a way we don't often get to see, which is pretty cool. Ryan Flesher took 6th place with Obzan Reanimator. Whip of Erebos decks in general have been getting popular lately. It's not surprising to see that players would opt for a deck that lets them run a whip strategy but also have cards like Siege Rhino and Elspeth to fall back on. That aside, this is a much more aggressive deck than Obzan midrange. There is some removal. You get your Hero's Downfall, your Murderous Cut, and even a couple Thoughtseizes. But it's mostly about milling a Hornet Queen or Siege Rhino into your graveyard, then whipping it back. Siege Rhino gives you the drain even when you whip it back, plus a 4/5 Trampler is solid even if it only hits once. Hornet Queen leaves behind 1/1 flying Death Touchers, which are useful for attacking or defending. There's a Reclamation Sage here, which can be whipped back for some utility. You also have 1 Soul of Theros to provide some extra utility regardless of whether you hardcast him or just mill him off. In particular, the first strike he grants is, best case scenario, basically a one-sided sweeper. We saw Philip Braverman's Mardu Tokens deck in 7th place. The deck seems based on the Butcher of the Horde-centric Mardu midrange decks we've been seeing on and off. As the name implies, it has a greater emphasis on token generators, adding 3 Raise the Alarm to full sets of Hordling Outburst and Rabblemaster. This being a Mardu deck, those tokens are going to serve 2 purposes, paying for Stoke the Flames and being eaten by the Butcher. Sorin and Wingmate Rock can also make tokens, though theirs are more useful for attacking than demon food. Sorin's +1 also gains quite a bit of power when it's distributed wide across an army of tokens. Basically, if you want to play mid-range leaning aggro but aren't a huge fan of Obzan, then this is a deck worth looking into. Bradley Yu rounds out our top 8 with Green-Black Constellation. This is another deck that we've seen on and off throughout this standard. Constellation now runs Whip of Erebos because, as we've seen, Whip and Hornet Queen go great together. Helping its case is that it's also an enchantment, so it triggers Eidolon of Blossoms and Doomwake Giant. This deck also has a couple cards we don't often see at all, let alone in this particular deck. Arbor Colossus used to be a Devotion standby, but hasn't been as popular recently. Still, this deck runs Nykthos, so the Colossus fits. Reaper of the Wilds isn't often seen either, but is still really hard to kill with 5 toughness and the ability to gain hexproof. It can also gain Death Touch, which lets it take out Siege Rhino without dying, always a useful feature. On top of all that, the Scry when other creatures die is a good way to build incremental advantage. Rounding out the oddball cards in the main deck is in Garruk's Wake. At 9 mana, its huge cost makes it impractical in most decks, but a one-sided sweep against creatures and planeswalkers is absolutely overwhelming if you can get to 9. And with Nykthos and a ton of green creatures, if any deck can get to 9 mana, this one can. Also worth noting, there's an additional in Garruk's Wake and the man himself, Garruk Apex Predator, on sideboard. And that wraps up this week's top 8. Wizards isn't running any more GPs until the new year, but Star City does have the Players' Championship next weekend. We'll be back with that next week. As always, subscribe below for the latest and most reliable Magic the Gathering information you could ever need. This is the Manosaurus, I'm Wedge, thanks for watching, we'll see you next time.
Wow.